Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning at whatever time you're listening to this message. Thank you for joining to listen. I've been asked by the Assembly here to have a little thought and a little meditation upon the Scriptures, and I was asked if I could share that meditation, those thoughts with the saints. And so I have chosen to look at Psalm number 10, and I would wish to consider that and the context of it, and what we can learn from it, and indeed some of the challenges that we can find within this psalm. We were due to look at Psalm number 10 before we entered our latest lockdown, whatever number that is, and as such I was looking at it beforehand, and as I looked into it a bit more, I found quite a challenge coming through from the words of the psalmist and the words of David as we think of Psalm number 10. So let's just read Psalm number 10, and we'll think a little bit more of the context of it as we begin our meditation of it. So, Psalm number 10. Why standest thou afar off, O Lord? Why hidest thou thyself in times of trouble? The wicked in his pride doth persecute the poor. Let them be taken in the devices that they have imagined. For the wicked boasteth of his heart's desires, and blesseth the covetous, whom the Lord abhorreth. The wicked through the pride of his countenance will not seek after God. God is not in all his thoughts. His ways are always grievous. Thy judgments are far above out of his sight. As for all his enemies, he puffeth at them. He hath said in his heart, I shall not be moved, for I shall never be in adversity. His mouth is full of cursing and deceit and fraud. Under his tongue is mischief and vanity. He sitteth in the lurking places in the villages. In the secret places doth he murder the innocent. His eyes are privily set against the poor. He lieth in wait secretly as a lion in his den. He lieth to wait in wait to catch the poor. He doth catch the poor when he draweth him into his net. He croucheth and humbleth himself, that the poor may fall by his strong ones. He hath said in his heart, God hath forgotten. He hideth his face, he will never see it. Arise, O Lord, O God, lift up thine hand. Forget not the humble. Wherefore doth the wicked contempt God? He hath said in his heart, thou wilt not require it. Thou hast seen it, for thou beholdest mischief and spite, to requite it with thine hand. The poor committeth himself unto thee. Thou art the helper of the fatherless. Break thou the arm of the wicked and the evil man. Seek out his wickedness till thou find none. The Lord is king forever and ever. The heathen are perished out of his land. Lord, thou hast heard the desire of the humble. Thou wilt prepare their heart. Thou wilt cause thine ear to hear, to judge the fatherless and the oppressed, that the man of the earth may no more oppress. And I'm sure the Lord will bless what we've read from the Bible this evening. Now, in Psalm number 10, perhaps you're wondering what kind of encouragement can we get from Psalm number 10? Well, I've got really broken the verses of Psalm 10 down into three primary sections. We'll break those sections down a wee bit further as well, at least some of them. I want to look, first of all, if we think of it, we think of verse 1 as David. From verses 2 to 11, we find the wicked. And from verses 12 to 18, we find God. And that's very high level. If I break that down a little bit further, well, we can't get away from verse 1. It's David's plea to God, and that's what he starts the psalm off with. But when we get to verses 2 to 11, we find a wee bit more description about the wicked people. And I've broken it down like this. In verse 2, we find the wicked and their pride. And we'll think something of these as we go through. Some of them are very quick, some of them we'll spend a little bit more time on. Verse 2, the wicked and their pride. Verse 3, the wicked and their boasting. Verse 4, the wicked and their rejection of God. Verse 5, the wicked and their blasé attitude. Verse 6, the wicked and their carefree belief. Verse 7, the wicked and their tongues. Verses 8 to 10, the wicked and their cowardice. Verse 11, the wicked and their disbelief. But then as we think of the section that I entitled God, in there we find in verses 12 to 13, we find David's plea to God for the wicked. In verses 14 and 15, we find David's understanding of God's working. And in verses 16 to 18, we find David's praise to God. Now, as we think of this psalm, as I started thinking, what is there to learn from this? Well, what I want to look at really is something of maybe what we think and consider of today and our society of today. Because David, as he starts the psalm, he appeals to God and he says, "Why standeth thou afar off, O Lord? Why hidest thou thyself in times of trouble?" And then he goes on to describe these wicked people. Now, as we'll see when we look into that section a wee bit further, you'll find that a lot of the characteristics that are mark the wicked people are marked in our society today. There's an awful lot of these characteristics that David describes as wicked people are prevalent in our world today, prevalent in our society, prevalent in the world in which we live. And we'll look at them in a bit more detail. But as we think of this, and as we consider what David has to say, what I want to encourage us with is that at the end of the verses, David might start off by questioning, "Where are you, God?" But by the end of that, he tells God exactly where he is. And, as we think of this, you might think, well, he's questioning God. And, well, I'm not sure exactly whether David is questioning God or not. He certainly is asking questions. We can see that from the text. There's question marks. But I'm not sure it's really questioning God over whether he believed it or not. I'm fully conscious of the fact, and I fully believe that David was asking, as it were, rhetorical questions of God. David is expressing himself to God. Now, I'm sure you've been in a situation like this before. You look around about you, you look at some of the things that are happening, and you're frustrated that these things are being allowed. You're frustrated that these things are being accepted. Now, as I said at the start, as we look at society, it's rife with this. And as we look on society, many times we get frustrated at why does God allow these things to happen. Now, that can be at a national level, or it could be at an international level. And we get ourselves frustrated and we think, why does God allow this? David was in this position. Yeah, but his confidence in God never failed. His confidence in what God was saying never failed either. And so as we consider this, and so as we think on this, what I want to encourage our hearts with tonight, or this afternoon, or this morning, whenever you're listening, what I want to encourage you with is this. David, while he reviews these wicked people, while he considers these wicked people, his confidence in God never failed. His confidence in God never wavered. His confidence in what God had to say and what God was going to do, it never fainted. It never changed. He was still faithful to God. And yes, David, perhaps in his frustration, asked God the question, "Why are you not working?" But when we come on to the end of the verses, we'll discover that David knew exactly what was going on. When you come to verse 14, David says, "The Lord sees." When you come to verse 17, he says, "The Lord knows." When you come to verse 18, he says, "The Lord judges." You see, David knew exactly what God was doing. Yes, David starts the psalm by saying, "Why?" But David knew why. And as I said, perhaps you've been in this circumstance before, as David was. He was frustrated by the things that were happening. He was frustrated by the things that were going on around about him. And he gets frustrated, but he prays, he appeals to God. I wonder, we might have our opinion on the things that are happening in our society, whether that's as a result of COVID, or whether that's perhaps a result of other elements that go along with our society, whether it's the immorality, whether it's the injustice, or whatever other circumstance you might think about. How often do we then take those matters and pray about them before God? How often do we take our frustration and present it before God? I believe that when David starts this psalm, he's taking his frustration as he looks around about him, and he's taking it before God, and he's asking God about it. Just as a side note to that, God desires to hear the prayers of saints. God desires to hear the heartfelt frustrations of men and women, of the saints. He wants to hear the desires of his children. And just as a side note to that, it is very important then that we must continue to pray. It's very important that we must take the problems that we have and present them to God, because God is the one who is able to help us. God is the one who is able to strengthen us, and he can provide us with a resource that we will always be surprised at how good and how much we receive when we bring it before God. But that's perhaps on a sidetrack to where I wanted to go. But nevertheless, a good matter to consider. God wants to hear the prayers, the frustrations of his saints. He wants to hear the heartfelt of his saints. And so David starts this psalm as he questions with his frustration as to why the wicked are running rampant in that respect in his time. And perhaps we could look at the same ourselves, and we could ask, well, why is these things being allowed to happen in our world today? Now we'll come back to that thought because the answers are found at the end of the psalm, and I want to think about them just very quickly at the end. But what I wanted to do as I consider this is, as David describes what these wicked people are characterized by, I couldn't help, as I considered them, to think that our perception of a wicked person might be slightly flawed. You say, what do you mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is this. When we consider a wicked person, we might think of someone who is violent, who is abusive, whether that's psychological or physical. And we can think of many different adjectives that we could use to describe someone who is wicked. And in our minds, we conjure up something of what we consider as someone who is wicked. Now, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, that will focus probably around about physical. But do you know, what David describes here as wicked people is not physical. Far from it. The majority of it is entirely within the mind. And as I was thinking of these things, I was drawn to consider my own life and to challenge myself. Now, I wouldn't, if you had asked me and said, are you a wicked person, then I would probably have said, no, I'm not a wicked person. But actually, when you look at some of the characteristics that David describes that marks wicked people, I would have to be a bit more hesitant about making that bold statement to say I'm not wicked. And I want to spend, for the next few minutes or so, I want to pick out some of these characteristics that mark the wicked people. And I want to cause us to think about our own lives. Challenge ourselves to see whether we are marked by characteristics of the wicked. Now, not all of these will be applicable. At least I hope not. And you'll see what I mean when I come through them. But I hope that by the end of it all, we will either identify that we have been marked with these characteristics and we need to change, or perhaps with confidence you could say that I've never expressed or I never demonstrated or never even gone through those processes. And if that's the case, then that is great. That is a very, very confident place to be. But as I said, I was challenged very firmly by these thoughts as I considered Psalm number 10. So let's get started then. We thought of verse number 1, David's personal plea to God, as he, in his frustration, appeals to God about how the wicked are being able to do the things that they are in his world and his time. And we can be found in the same circumstances in many occasions. But when we come, we're going to look from verses 2 to 11 as David describes in this psalm the characteristics of the wicked people. And we will nominally take it verse by verse until we get to the end where there's maybe a few verses bunched together. And so we start at verse number 2. Verse number 2 says, the wicked in his pride doth persecute the poor. Well, do you know, pride is one of those things that, well, it's very easy to do. And it's something that we can very easily display. But it starts from within. In our society today, we are taught to be proud. We are taught to promote ourselves. We are taught to express ourselves in the best way possible, to paint the biggest picture that we can of ourselves and be pompous and proud of what we've achieved. I've cited this on many occasions, and it continues to baffle me every time I think about it. I have to do CVs when we're bidding for jobs, and for a normal job, whatever a normal job really is, but for a normal job, we would put a normal CV out. It's based around the facts. The majority of the content of that is very much factually based on my experience, based on my history, based on my evidence, etc., etc. But you know, when it comes to bidding for American jobs, and we do a lot of military work, and American jobs are some of the jobs that we get, when we're bidding for American jobs, the CV takes a completely different tact. And there is all self-promotion and how I was proud of being able to achieve this, and I was proud of being able to demonstrate that. And these are words that are used within the CV to try and demonstrate my competence in my field in order to be selected as one of those people to win the job. And every time I sit down to write one of these things, it really sticks in my throat. It's not the first time I've asked one of my colleagues or one of my superiors to write my CV for me, because I just feel that it's just wrong the way it's been written. But that is our society. That is how we are being presented. That is how we are taught to present ourselves. And everything in life really surrounding our society is all about making ourselves better and making ourselves look better. And there's an awful lot of it is based on this pride. Proud of what we've achieved, proud of where we've come from, proud of what we've done. David says pride is the mark of a wicked person. And there is other scriptures to support that as well. But it's something that we can get sucked into as well. I've just mentioned my CVs. And I hate doing those CVs. Sometimes I do them, and I have to do them because we're trying to win jobs that we can then work with in my employment. But it really grates on me to do that. But it's something that we can very easily get caught up in. And perhaps in a more subtle way. If we achieve something in life, whether that's a promotion, whether that's, something else that we've managed to achieve in life, whether it's a personal goal or a personal gain, we can get so taken up with what we've managed to achieve ourselves that we find ourselves being proud of what we've done. And telling people that we're proud of it. David says, these pride people, these wicked people, they were proud. He says, the wicked in his pride doth persecute the poor. In our pride, very often there are people who are affected by our proudness, who are affected by our pride. Now, maybe that's, just using this as an example, and it's nothing specific in that respect, but supposing you've managed to achieve a marathon run, and you're so proud of the fact, and you're expressing it to everybody, and you're telling everybody how good it was that you were able to run the marathon. There's somebody there, perhaps, who's been running, and they've been struggling to get to that marathon, and they can't. They're like that poor, less fortunate person, and your pride runs them down, hammers them into the ground, and they feel demoralized, they feel weak, they feel unachievable. And your pride has affected someone else. And that's what David's saying. He says the pride, they persecute the poor, and they say, let themselves be taken in their own devices. I couldn't help but think of a perfect example of this exact expression. When you look at the book of Esther, you find in the book of Esther, you find a man who was proud. Mordecai, he was a humble man. But when you think of Haman, he was a proud man. He was so proud of his position before the king that he felt that everyone should bow down to him. And Mordecai didn't. And Haman built gallows. And his intention was that he would ultimately hang Mordecai on those gallows. But God was in control. That's really the point of what I'm trying to get across in my message this evening, or this afternoon, or this morning, whenever you're listening, is the fact that God is still in control. And as Haman planned to use the gallows to ultimately hang Mordecai on, God had a different plan, and what ultimately happened was Haman was exposed for his pride, and he was hung on his own gallows. And as David says here, he says, the pride persecute the poor. And he says, let them be taken in their devices that they have imagined. Can I challenge us? As our society promotes itself through pride, and there's also a movement called Pride, that's a separate thought process in itself, but as society moves itself along in pride, are we proud? David says it's a characteristic of a wicked person that's marked by pride. And there will be people affected by our pride. And it's those that are less fortunate or haven't achieved or haven't attained to what we had. And as a result, people will be hurt. So I challenge us, are you a proud person? David says, as the psalmist says, that's a mark of a wicked person. Pride. Verse number 3 then, because we will have to move through these. Verse number 3, it says there, for the wicked boasteth in his heart's desire, and blesseth the covetous, whom the Lord abhorreth. Do you know, boasting and pride, they go very well together. And it's not surprising that David has them this way recorded. There is that pride, and then there's that boasting. And that boasting comes for when we are telling others, when we are promoting ourselves, when we are pushing ourselves forward, and, well, we're just letting people know how good we are. David says that's the mark of a wicked person. here they are, they're boasting of their heart's desire. They're boasting about the things that they've done. They're boasting, another version says, about their evil desires. And they praise the greedy and curse the Lord. Do you know, if I was to describe that of our society today, would that not be the perfect summary? They boasteth in what they've done. And they praise the greedy. And they curse God. That sums our society up in perfect harmony. Those three little expressions together, exactly what our society is rife with. But what about us? What about you? What about me? Do we boast? Are we proud? You know, Paul tells us that if we are to boast, we're to boast in the death of the Lord Jesus Christ. Our Christian lives are not about what we've done. And I'm kind of tying pride and boasting together in this. Our life is not about being proud about what we've achieved. What we achieve in life is good, and that is commendable. But it's not something to be overly proud about. And it's not something that we should be boasting about. Because what we should be boasting about is the love of the Lord Jesus, is the faithfulness of God, is the provision of God as He's made way and made provision for us in salvation. It's not about what we've done. It's not about what we can do. It's about what Christ has already done. And so David here, the first two verses that we've looked at, verse 2 and verse 3, he talks about the pride of the wicked and the boasting of the wicked. And these are two things that we as Christians can very easily get taken up with, very easily get caught out with, because of the society we live in, because of the society we are inherently involved in. But I challenge myself, as I hope to challenge you as well, to consider, as a Christian, we should not be proud and we should not be boasting. These are characteristics that mark a wicked person. In verse number 4, he says there, the wicked through the pride of his countenance will not seek after God. God is not in all his thoughts. I've got another version. I like this version to read, and it says, the wicked are too proud to seek God. They seem to think that God is dead. Again, I'm only going to mention this one passing. I trust and I hope that this is not something that is marking a Christian. It certainly should not. But if we think of our society, it definitely is. And our society and the wicked people that live within our society are very much are too proud to seek God. God does not feature in their thoughts. God does not feature in their lives. In fact, we've just had our gospel message just before I record this. And there's a person who commented to say, teaching Jesus is abuse. What sort of lies is that? But that's exactly this expression. It says the wicked are too proud to seek God. They seem to think that God is dead. God is very much alive, as is the Lord Jesus. And the judgment of God will come to those who think in such manners and in such ways. But I challenge us, the wicked and their rejection of God, surely that's not something that would mark a Christian. Verse 5, I'm also just going to mention in passing, he says, his ways are always grievous, thy judgments are far above out of his sight, as for all his enemies he puffeth at them. Do you know, sometimes we look at our society around about us, and I've said at the start, we wonder how is it that these things keep happening? How is it they're allowed to do these things? And in many ways we wonder, why is it that the wicked of our world seem to succeed? Why is it that the people with the wicked thoughts are in government? Why is it that people with wicked thoughts are in place of power? But God is still in control. This verse is telling us, they seem to succeed in everything that they do. And they don't think there's any punishment awaiting them. And, well, they just sneer at anybody who challenges them, any of their enemies. They just turn their noses up. And that is really what he's saying here. The judgments are far out of his sight. They think that God will never judge them. And he puffeth at his enemies. He sneers at his enemies. This person who's expressing this characteristic, this blasé attitude, as I've called it, they just think God's not there. That's very much rife in our world today. I hope it's not marked by a Christian. I hope a Christian does not feel this way either. I know sometimes we can get frustrated when things keep happening and things keep being allowed to happen, and we question and we ask why. But I trust our attitude never gets to this point where we think that God will never judge, and perhaps that God is not even alive. And so, as I say, I mention this only in the passing, that people deny that the judgment of God is waiting for them. They deny there even is a God. The Bible tells us the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And so just in the passing, the wicked and their blasé attitudes. And as I said, we see that in our circumstances and our society around about us. In verse number 6, he that hath said in his heart, I shall not be moved, for I shall never be in adversity. I've got another version, this other version I've used, and again I think it summarises it very well. It says, they think nothing bad will ever happen to us. We will be free of trouble forever. And again, this is very prevalent in our world today. And perhaps even, it might even be in our lives. Again, this is one of those ones that really challenged me. And there is a mindset, there is a frame of mind which is very prevalent in our world today, and that is, I can do something wrong so long as I don't get caught. How often have we seen that? How often have we heard that? How often have we thought that ourselves? And it's this very carefree, the carefree belief of, I'll never get caught. If I don't get caught, then I've done nothing wrong. But that's not true. That's the mark, that's the characteristic of a wicked person. Nothing bad will ever happen to us. We'll never be held accountable for it. But David says that is what marks a wicked person. Do you know, if I could apply this a little bit more personally to us, as I say, these are challenges that have come to me personally, and I'm passing those challenges on, and I trust that as I do, they might challenge ourselves. Perhaps in our Christian life, we might have, I don't really like the expression, but maybe it's just for ease of understanding, maybe we have a secret sin. There is no such thing as a secret sin in the sense that God knows all things. But it might be a secret sin in the fact that other people don't know about it. God does, but other people might not. And perhaps in your life, perhaps in the life of somebody that's listening to this message, perhaps there is something within their life and it's a secret sin, and it's something that is eating away at them. It's something that they're continually involved in, something that continually think or do, and you think that you can just keep going. And because nothing has happened, nothing will happen. And so you think that, well, I'm okay to keep going. That's the characteristic of a wicked person. That's what David says is the characteristic of a wicked person. Not me, this is what David's saying. And perhaps that might be just something that marks our life, and there's something in our lives that is offensive to God, but nobody else knows. And because nobody else knows, we think it's okay. But God knows. God knows all things. Nothing is hidden from God. God can see all things. He knows the very motives of our hearts. And from this point of view, I want to challenge you as I challenge myself. Are there things in my life that perhaps are not fitting for a Christian? Perhaps are not acceptable before God? And perhaps nobody else knows about them. But God does. And am I still displaying? Am I still carrying on? Am I still doing these things in my life when I shouldn't? David says, I'm like a wicked person if I am. I leave the challenge there. It is a challenging one. And it's something that we really need to think about. Because just because nobody else can see it, God can. And so, verse number 6 is the wicked and their carefree belief that no judgment will come because it will never happen to us. Do you know, I think of as an example of that, Ananias and Sapphira. They sold land and they brought money and they presented it before Paul. And they said that they had brought everything. Nothing wrong with that. But there was something wrong because they hadn't brought everything. They'd only brought a portion. Now that wasn't wrong in itself either. But they told lies. They said that they had brought everything. Excuse me. And in doing that, they were thinking within their head, nothing will come of us, nothing bad will come to us if we just say that we've given everything. Both of them, by the end of that story, are dead because They told lies. They thought they could get away with it. They thought they would never get caught. They thought they would never get found out. But God knew. And it's a good example of just exactly where we can find ourselves. There was a little verse that was always quoted to me when I was younger, and it says this: be sure your sin will find you out. And you know, I can look through, if I'm honest, I can look through my life, and I can tell you that verse is 100% true. So many times in my life when I've sinned, and I've been found out. In some of the most bizarre ways I could never even have imagined, I have been found out. Be sure your sin will find you out. So the wicked and their carefree belief. I want to touch in verse 7. This is the last one we'll think about in any detail. And it's the wicked and their tongues. The wicked and their tongues. The tongue is something that we use regularly, perhaps a little bit more now than maybe we would have. Another version that I've been using, and I'll quote it to you, it's very interesting. It says, their mouths are full of cursing, lies and threats. Trouble and evil are on the tips of their tongues. The verse that we read in our Bible from the King James Version says, his mouth is full of cursing and deceit and fraud. Under his tongue is mischief and vanity. Talking to someone face to face is one thing. And in many respects, it holds us accountable as we speak to the person in front of us. In our current circumstances, in our current technology world, and given the current circumstances with COVID, the technology has become very prevalent. I wonder just how much of control we have of our tongues. The Bible talks about gossips, talebearers, and it talks about how that is sinful. And it talks about how we need to control our tongues. You know, as David was describing here, he describes those people and they're full of cursings and deceit and fraud. The other version I read, it says that they're full of cursing, lies and threats. And you know, I wonder just when we're having conversations with people, whether that's on conference calling, whether that's on WhatsApp, whether that's on social media, I wonder how much of the information we pass with our tongues is lies. Everybody loves a great story. We all do. And if we're honest with ourselves, you hear a little bit of gossip and you think, oh, I want to know more. But you see, that's the problem, because people give a little bit more. And what starts as the truth expands a little bit and a little bit more and a little bit more. And of course, you know what Chinese whispers is all about when that game was played when you were younger. Perhaps you still play it now, but it starts off with a factual element, and then by the time it gets round the ring or the circle or whatever way it's going, the statement is completely changed from what it started as. You see, that's just like the lying tongues. Proverbs 12 and verse 22 says, lying lips are an abomination unto the Lord, but they that deal truly are his delight. I wanted to challenge us again. In a world in which technology and communication is so prevalent, how much control do we have on our tongues? Is there lies across our tongues? Is there threats across our tongues? Dare I say it, is there ever cursings across our tongues? There's a lot of acronyms that are bandied about nowadays, and I hear it in my children. And in their innocency, they perhaps repeat it, not knowing the context of what it actually means. And you know, it is a cursing to God. It is taking the Lord's name in vain. But yet it's so common and so prevalent in our world. You see, David is describing these wicked people. And while David might have been describing these way back in the time before Christ, in the times BC, they're absolutely valid in 2021 AD as they were back in BC. We have to be very careful with our tongues. And I challenge us again as we consider this, as David talks about these people these wicked people who are full of cursings and deceit and fraud and with mischief and vanity on the tips of their tongues. Is our tongue under control? Is our tongue righteous before God? Is our tongue spreading forth the love of God, or is it the deceit and the threats and the lies that come across our tongues? Let us not be marked by those characteristics of a wicked person. Let us promote the love of God. Let us promote by our tongues the greatness of God, the faithfulness of God, the salvation of Christ. The wicked and their tongues. And the challenge, of course, that comes to us about our tongues as well. I said that was going to be the last one I'm going to think about in detail, and it is verses 8 to 10. We think about the wicked and their cowardice. They pick on those who are weak. They pick on those who are small. They pick on those who are less fortunate. Very evident in our world today, is it not? You have, as is well spoken of, those at the top of the tree, and it's very heavy. Those who are well off, those who are rich, those who are full of glory and fame and all these other things. And then there's a smaller gap in between, and then there's at the other end of that scale, there are those who are picked upon, those who are at the expense of those at the top of the tree, those who have been stood upon and run over, and all the other elements and adjectives we can describe to make sure those people at the top get to the top. David says that's just exactly what the wicked man does, the wicked person does. They use the less fortunate and the poor, and they make them the problem that they can use to get up higher. And it's cowardice. They pick on the weak, and they pick on the small. Again, I trust that's not something that we as Christians use. We will not use the less fortunate for our own personal gains or our own boasting or pride. If we go back to the very start of what we were thinking of in these wicked characteristics, let us always be building up those who are weak. Let us always be supporting those who are poor. And there is much in the way of the Scriptures to support that as we think of that characteristic. So, David says, the wicked and their cowardice. I trust that nobody in our Christian lives are marked by the cowardice of these wicked people. It is certainly evident in our world today, but it's not something that should mark us. The last one then is verse 11, and the wicked and their disbelief. He hath said in his heart, God hath forgotten, he hideth his face, he will never see it. Again, my other translation that I use, the wicked think, God isn't watching us. He's closed his eyes, he won't even see what we do. Again, prevalent in our world today, prevalent in our society today. They just think that God doesn't exist. They don't want to believe that God exists, and they just refuse to accept that God is even there. They just, as David describes, they've just got their eyes closed, and they're not considering him at all. Well, David says these are the characteristics that mark those who are wicked. Let me just run through them very quickly. Verse 2, the wicked and their pride, something that can affect us. The wicked and their boasting also can affect us. The wicked and their rejection of God, hopefully it doesn't affect us. The wicked and their blasé attitude, again, hopefully not. The wicked and their carefree belief, perhaps that can. The secret sin that perhaps affects our life, God knows. The wicked and their tongues, again, one that we can be affected by what we say, by what we pour out across our lips. The wicked and their cowardice, again, hopefully not something that will affect us as Christians. And the wicked and their disbelief. Surely as Christians we cannot say that God is not real, that God is not listening, that God has closed his eyes. God is real. God has not closed his eyes. God is still in control. And that leads us on nicely to exactly what David says as he considers what God has done. While he started the psalm saying why, he comes on and he understands. He says, arise, O Lord. O God, lift up thine hand, forget not the humble. Now, this is David's plea for those wicked people. He says, the wicked contempt God. Why do the wicked get away with despising God? The other version says, they think God will never call us to account. But David isn't saying that as a statement of fact. He's saying it in a rhetorical fashion. Do they really think that God will not call them to judgment on it? Do the wicked really think that God is not going to judge them? When, of course, David is actually saying, of course they're going to be judged. And our society and our world in which we live will ultimately be judged for the things that they have done. Whether that's at the judgment seat before a righteous and a holy God who sits there as a judge, whether it's there or whether there is events that happen in their life on earth, judgment will fall. God will not miss the judgment that is befitting to them for their actions and their decisions and the things that they have done that are sinful and are wicked as far as what David describes in the Scriptures before God. And David appeals to God for the wicked, that judgment may fall upon them. But he knows that God is judging, and God will judge. And that gives him comfort, that gives him confidence. He might have started by saying his frustration that why is this happening? But his confidence in God gives him this comfort in his mind that God will judge. And these things will not escape God. And God will bring judgment upon those who deal and dwell in such manners. In verses 14 to 15, we have David's understanding of God's working. He says there, "Thou hast seen it, for thou beholdest mischief and spite to requite it with thine hand. The poor committeth himself to thee. Thou art the helper of the fatherless." In verse 15 he says, "Break thou the arm of the wicked and the evil man. Seek out his wickedness till thou find none." You know, we might be frustrated at the government that we have. We might be frustrated by the rules that they pass, by the laws that they agree to. We might be frustrated by the things of society that really affect us. But we must remember that while these characteristics of wicked people are rife in our world today, and while we can look and quite clearly see them across our globe, God is still in control. God is still understanding of what is going on in our world today. God knows the grief that it causes. He knows of the trouble that it brings to his people. But he says, David says, "Thou art the helper." And for us, while we might be frustrated as we look on at the things that go on round about us, as we look at our society and hopefully not within ourselves see these characteristics, but as we look around, God has a control over it all. And he is able to help us. But what do we need to do? We need to be trusting in him. You see, David, as I said, he started off frustrated. But we come to the end of these verses, and by this time, David, he has his confidence back in God. He has his confidence trusting in the God of heaven to help, as he says in this verse. And as a result of that, those who trust in God, he will help them regardless. And regardless what circumstances we face, whether we're facing society, whether we're facing other elements, whether we're facing challenges specifically, God is still in control. God can give us the help. But we must be trusting in him. We must be focused on him. We must have our thoughts centered upon him. As I said, David started frustrated, and by now we get to verses 14 and 15, we find David's confidence is back in God. When we find ourselves in a circumstance, like I outlined at the very start of our message tonight, when we think of that, how often do we find ourselves thinking of the frustration and then turning it to confidence in God? I ask you this question because I challenge myself with it. Does my confidence in God reign as strong as David's did? Do I turn to God when the wicked things that happen around about me affect me? Or do I just go on with it? My final question on this point is quite simply this. Do I still believe that God is in control of the governments and the globe and the society we live in? Or have I lost my confidence in God? I use this as a challenge because David understood the working of God, and that's what we find in these last couple of verses of this psalm. David had his confidence in God. Where is my confidence? Is my confidence in God? Or am I trusting in myself? I throw that as a challenge to you. Let us not be marked by the characteristics of the wicked, and we've thought of them. But as we think of those around us, as we think of the society we live in, as we think of the frustrations that so often cross our minds and the frustrations of the things that are happening, does that bring the confidence in God out in us? Or does our faith waver? Be like David. David's confidence was in God. He will seek out the judgment of those who are wicked, and he will help the fatherless, as he thought of in this. He will be a helper if we are trusting in God. The last two verses then of this psalm is verses 17 and 18. And it says there, "The Lord, thou hast heard the desire of the humble. Thou wilt prepare their heart. Thou wilt cause thine ear to hear, to judge the fatherless and the oppressed, that the man of the earth may no more oppress." You know, in verses 16 to 18, we find David's praise to God. We've had his understanding of the working of God and his confidence in God. And now we come to David's praise to God. Again, I challenge you, as I challenged myself, in all the frustrations that I face in the world today, does my confidence in God bring out the praise to God? I have to be honest, that doesn't always happen. And I'm sure if you really looked at yourself and considered it yourself, it doesn't happen either. But you know, with David it was there. He had the confidence in God, and it brought out the praise in David's mind. He says there, the Lord is king forever. Verse 16, the heathen are perished out of the land. He says, the Lord has heard the desire of the humble, and thou wilt prepare their heart. Thou wilt cause thine ear to hear. And at the end of verse 18 he says that the man of the earth may no more oppress. There is the praise from David to God for what God will do. Excuse me. And David's confidence was in God, and it brought out the praise of God. The Lord is king forever. He is the ruler. We might look around about our society and the governments and the authorities that we are dealing with in our land, but God is king. He is king forever. The Lord is king forever. And we have the confidence in that, or we should have the confidence in that. And that in itself brings out the praise of our hearts. The Lord listens and comforts those who are trusting in Him. In verse 17, He'll prepare their heart. He will listen. In verse 18, He is bringing forward the thought that we will no longer be oppressed by the wicked. There's coming a day when the wicked will not reign. There's coming a day when there will be no sin. And the Lord Almighty, the King of Kings, will reign. What a day that will be. That was a prospect that David was looking forward to. I wonder, are we looking forward to that? Sometimes we say we are. I understand that. I'm looking forward to that day, or that day can't be long. And that might be true. But do we live by it? Does our life reflect that? I challenge you as I challenge myself. Do I live in the good of the soon return of the Lord? Am I living each day in such a way? I've often thought, and I've often challenged myself. If I knew the day I would die, if I knew the appointed time in which I would be taken from this life into eternity, my life would be different. My life would be geared around about fulfilling what I was set out to do. In that respect, preaching the gospel, speaking to as many people as I can, fearless of what might happen, because I know my time is not until that time. It's how I should be living my life. It's how you should be living your life. It should be that we take it day by day, and that in a measure is true. We should be living day by day, but the next day might be our last day. And did we achieve what we should have done in this day before the next day might be our last? And I know that maybe sounds a little bit morbid, but it's not. It's a prospect that we have. It's a future hope that we have. But our lives today should be lived on the basis of the soon return of our Lord. David wanted to encourage the people as he records this in his psalm, and he says, there is coming a day when the man of the earth may no longer oppress. Can I challenge us? Can I encourage us that we need to live our lives with the prospect and the hope of the soon return of the Lord, live our lives accordingly, and reach out in our hearts to do what God would have us to do as we serve Him daily, as we serve Him faithfully. And as we've thought of the characteristics that David describes that mark wicked people, may it be that as we live our lives in the prospect of the soon return of the Lord, that none of those characteristics would mark us. No pride, no boasting, no blasé attitudes, no carefree believing, no lies or deceit across our tongues. As I say, I found this very, very challenging to my heart. And I found it very practical, really, as I thought through what David has to say about these wicked people. And it really brought home the point to me that I need to have a look at my life. I need to challenge myself that as I live my life day to day, as I communicate in whatever manner I communicate these days, that it must be befitting a Christian. It must be befitting the righteousness of God. And it might be befitting what would be a characteristic that would be marked of Christ, not a characteristic marked as someone who is wicked. I trust these thoughts have been a challenge to you. And perhaps an encouragement to us as well, that God is still in control. And while we might be frustrated by the things of our society, of our government, of various other things that go on around about us, God is still in control. And while we might be frustrated, our trust, our faith, our confidence can be in God. And from that, our praise can pour out. And we can worship the one who is King forever. We can worship the one who will help us. We will worship the one who ultimately one day will rule supreme in this world. And he will have removed the oppression of sin. I trust the Lord will bless our thoughts and our meditations on Psalm number 10. And I trust that the challenge might come to you as it has come to me.